I always like to kind of anchor on where we've been and where we're going in this talk. And so the way that this has kind of emerged, it wasn't really by design, but it's the way it's kind of emerged is we're really walking through my Agile transformation talk that I've been doing for the last several years. Probably rolled it out, I think this current iteration, kind of its current form in maybe 2017. We were going to do a revise of it with some of the new stuff that we've been learning over the last couple of years at Agile 20. I guess it was 2020 that got canceled, and so we're kind of walking through. And what's interesting about this, and from my point of view, what's interesting is that we're really basically taking a talk that has maybe literally gets done in about an hour, and we're breaking out maybe 16, 20 concepts into their own hour talk. And so we did our first series around the value of Agile, right? And so we talked a little bit about what it is we're really trying to accomplish with an Agile transformation. So we talked about things like, I'm not going to write them down, it's probably take me too long, but it's like predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, product fit, and innovation. And what I'm really building on when I talk about that, right? We talk about the value drivers, is that we're not adopting Agile. We're not transforming our organization because we just want to do Agile, or because we think we're gonna have a great culture, or it's gonna be a fun place to work, right? All those things they're awesome, right? And those are our added benefits of adopting Agile. But if we can't basically tie back to something ultimately that the business cares about, it's really difficult to sustain a transformation. Like if we can't say, here's our hypothesis, like this is what we're going to get for the transformation. This is how it's going to produce better business benefits. And then actually go through a series of steps that actually produce those business benefits. Businesses lose interest pretty quickly, right? And so we learned that, the hard way, right? I mean, as you guys know, it's no secret, we're a consultancy, and, we sell consulting services to people. And, when we come in and do an Agile transformation with somebody, if they're not getting direct business benefit from it, they get pretty tired of paying us pretty quickly, right? And so we learned how very early on to anchor everything that we did to an actual business outcome, right? Because it actually matters. And what I would suggest is that even if you guys are embedded in companies and internal coaches in companies and things like that, that you guys have kind of the same obligation too, right? Because payroll and salaries and things like that, and you're impacting the organization's ability to produce. So it all matters, right? Being able to tie back to business drivers matters. So that was kind of like the first set of ideas, right? So we did a 6-part webinar series diving into each of those 6 things that I just listed out. And then you kind of have to pivot the conversation. You say, okay, well, Mike, that's great, right? We want to focus on business drivers. What do we go do, right? So this little series we have, this little 2-part series that we're doing, is around like, what do you go do, right? What is it? Like if you were a king, right? I like to use this metaphor a lot. So if you were king for the day, and your CEO comes along and says, okay, yep, we have to do this Agile transformation. Go for it, right? You have all the money, you have all the time, you have all the agency, you have all the support, right? I'll give you anything you need. Like, what do you go do, right? And so one of my, and it's still kind of a pet peeve of mine, right? And it's like, we talk about in Agile this idea of culture quite a bit. And it's interesting, right? Because it's like, I don't want to devalue the role of culture in an Agile transformation, because culture is a big thing. But if you start to ask yourself, like, how do I change culture? Like, how do I go from command and control to an empowering organization where I delegate decisions down to the lowest level of the organization? Like, how do I do that, right? And so I'm willing to kind of admit that culture and then, its sister word mindset are super important. But the question is like how do you get there? Right. And so what we talked about last week is we said, okay, so if you do a culture first transformation and you start down this path of trying to change hearts and minds around Agile and how you do this stuff, it's like, okay, so let's say we've changed our hearts and mind. How do we tie that back to the business driver, right? How does being an empowering leader that trusts their people and creates a great work environment, like, how does that necessarily impact our ability to be predictable? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. How does that change our ability to deliver with greater quality or to get early return on investment? Like, I don't know. Like, so even if you believe it does, there's like a path from, okay, what about the culture change is going to change the business driver? And so you got to know, right? You got to know what that mechanism is, because I will tell you, it doesn't always work that way. You do have all these cultural messages, cultural training, and sometimes the business drivers don't change, right? So if you're king for a day, right, you can do anything you want, but you're accountable for the outcome, then you got to know, right? You got to know what the path is. And I always like to talk about that cartoon with the two scientists. I actually need to probably drop it in my presentation because I talk about it all the time. Two scientists sitting at the board. It's like math on one side and math on the other. And there's like a big cloud in the middle. It says, then a miracle happens here. One scientist says to the other in a little tagline, I think you need to be more specific in step 2. So that's like a joke in leading Agile a lot, is whenever somebody has an idea and we're not quite sure how to get there, somebody will say, I think you need to be more specific in step 2. So the question with culture is, okay, so let's say we could wave a magic wand and we could change culture. Like, what are we going to do after that, right? Well, so we talked last week also about the idea of a practices first Agile transformation, right? Well, let's train everybody on how to do Scrum. Let's train everybody on how to do SAFe. Let's get product owners trained. Let's get Scrum Masters trained. Let's get team members trained. Sometimes practices are technical practice. Let's get everybody doing TDD, and let's get CI/CD pipelines built and all these different stuff, right? And so skills are good, right? Skills transfer is good. But, let's say we teach people how to do Scrum. That's like the simplest example, or maybe teach people how to do SAFe, but we still don't have the culture change, right? So we're still operating in a command and control framework, or we're still operating with heavyweight governance, or we're still operating in functional silos, right? All that kind of stuff. And so teaching people how to do Scrum, if it's not congruent with how the organization operates, can often be somewhat disruptive and counterproductive. And the hypothesis behind a lot of the Agile methodologies is if you start to practice the methodology, then what's going to happen is it's going to show you your impediments, and you're going to expose the impediments, and then you're going to remove the impediments, and life is good, right? And sure, sometimes some of the place, right? But a lot of the organizations we go into, and a lot of the organizations you guys work into or work in, are really large and complicated. And so it's like incessant problem after problem after problem after problem after problem after problem, right? The impediments are large, and they don't get resolved overnight, and people get really super frustrated. And then the execs are like, well, you didn't tell me that this really tight coupling of my mainframe was going to be the thing that's going to be able to stop me from being able to produce working tested software at the end of the sprint. And it's going to totally destabilize velocity. And without velocity and the size of my backlog, I'm never going to get to predictability. And predictability was like the thing that I wanted out of all things. Or I wanted early return on investment. I want to be able to put things in market. And what you're telling me is that it's actually my whole deployment pipeline, right? And so Scrum will indeed show you that. To some degree, SAFe will show you that. But if you don't have agency within your organization to go fix those things, right, you don't necessarily get the value that you wanted out of it. And that's what happens a lot, right? So people say, okay, I'm going to put some money, I'm going to bring in some trainers, or I'm going to bring in some coaches, I'm going to do some skills transfer, some practices work, but the impediments are so large, right? They've spent the money, and it actually costs more money to go out and remove the impediments, and they didn't really sign up to remove the impediments in the way that we're suggesting, the way that's really necessary. And so we don't get the value, right? And so people get pretty down on Scrum or SAFe or whatever it is, right? We don't get the value out of it that we expected. And so what we made the case for last week was this idea that the actual challenge with doing a transformation, the thing that we're actually trying to transform, is really the structure and alignment of the organization, right? So we want teams organized around value, right? Sometimes that's value streams, sometimes it's products, sometimes it's around feature sets, sometimes it's around business capabilities in really large organizations. And so, but we want encapsulated teams, right? We know how to do encapsulated teams. We can design an org around encapsulated teams. And we can, in the presence of dependencies, we can understand how we want to govern the flow of value across teams and how we want to manage cross-cutting concerns. Those are kinds of things that can be somewhat designed. We can start to talk about what it is we measure and control in a large organization. And so we can start off, right? We don't have to do a big upfront design, but we can start off with a hypothesis around the structure of the organization that we know is going to lead to greater business agility, right? So we know that when we form complete cross-functional teams, that is a key, right? So rather than teach a non-cross-functional team, a non-value aligned team Scrum, or teach them how to empower their people or to have an agile mindset, and then hope that the structure emerges out of that greater understanding, right? What I'm kind of suggesting is that transformation is about getting the structure in alignment first, and then enabling that structure with really solid, pragmatic practices. And then once you get the operating model, the structure and how it runs, operating in an agile way, then what you can start to do is start to teach the organization how to exploit its new capabilities to be able to plan smaller batches and to put things into market and to experiment with customers and to, because we have encapsulated teams that are predictable, that can deliver a stable velocity, we can start to trust them more, right? We can start to empower them more. We can start to make them more goal-oriented, right? But it's really, really difficult. And I've done it a lot of different ways, right? We've been running Leading Agile, like Tim said, for over 10 years. Been in this stuff for almost 20 at this point. Probably was early 2002, 2003, first got introduced into Agile. And I'm just telling you, it's been a long road and it's been a lot of learning to do this. But when you start with some of these things, the culture and the practices, it cannot lead to the structural and alignment outcomes that you want. And if that doesn't happen, then you don't get the business value that you want. And so like what we've decided to do, like what we've gone to market with, is this idea of let's figure out how to get the structures right, install the practices, and then ultimately move the culture. And, one of the things we don't have the time to deal with a lot of questions in the course of these things, but Tim kind of gives me like summaries of like the general feedback. And one thing that I know that's really frustrating sometimes when you listen to a talk like this is if you're down in the bowels of the organization, project manager, developer, or something like that, doing the work of the organization, it's really hard to take some of these things that I'm talking about and say, well, how do I do that in my group? Right. And I get it, right? It's really tough. And so even when I went out as an independent consultant and started Leading Agile back August 1st, 2010 was our start date as a company. It was just me at the time. I had the same problem. Because like I'm getting hired in as a coach and I might be coaching 4 or 5 teams or doing a transformation in a small organization. And if it's a single team or group of teams in a much larger organization, I don't have the ability to influence everything, right? It wasn't the CEO or the CIO that hired me into doing this. And so one of the things that I really encourage practitioners to think about, and I think this is like really important, is to understand these concepts that I'm talking about. And I do think to some degree it's possible to operate locally, but we have to be like really smart and really pragmatic, right? You talk about, we're going to go into this in the next webinar series a little bit more. We're going to go back into the teams, backlogs, working tested software thing, but that's like the hallmark of everything. So like if I'm down in the bowels, right, I'm down at the team level, at the project level, like what I know is that I need a dedicated team, a dedicated cross-functional team, T-shaped people, right? Everything and everyone necessary to deliver something. And I need a really clear backlog, and I need to be able to produce a working tested increment of software at the end of every sprint. And that's what I need in order to be able to operate at the bottom. And so what I would do is I do my best to create those conditions. I do my best to create that structure locally, enable it with solid practices, and then start to work on the culture. But I'm going to be super pragmatic. If I can't create the conditions, I'm not going to double down on the practices in the same way. I'm going to have to get creative with the practices and realize that the ability to impact culture is going to be somewhat limited. So I'm going to be really super pragmatic. That's what I'm doing if I'm down at the team level. If I'm at the top, if I'm a CEO or if I'm a CIO or somebody who has like span of control over the organization, and I'm the one spending the big dollars to do this, then I'm not going to jack around with, bringing in a bunch of training if it's not also in parallel with this idea of alignment and structural transformation that I've been talking about. So all three are important, and I will concede, right? I will concede that culture is an important thing, But the mechanism by which you change culture is putting people in value-based containers, enabling them with really solid iterative and incremental practices, Scrum, Safe, XP, things like that, and then teaching them how to operate in that new container with those new practices to start to change how they're thinking about bringing products to market. That's how you do transformation. Okay, so if you want to go deeper into that, I know I probably spent the first 10 minutes of this talk talking about it, but I think it's important. You want to go deeper into that. When we get this done, Tim will send you the link to both of them, and you can go back and you can watch that talk if you want to. So where we're going to pick up today is we're going to pick up with what's hard, right? Why is this difficult? Like, why don't people just get this stuff? And the dimensions that I want to talk about a little bit are really three things. Is in things that like matter when you're thinking about how to orchestrate a transformation. So the three things that I'm going to explore a little bit with you guys today are the size of the organization. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about the complexity of the organization. And like anything, right? If you guys have been paying attention to any of these things, it's like dependencies are the thing that really gets in the way of almost all business agility at scale, right? Almost all. And then what I'm going to do is this is kind of the fun one. This is the human side of it. But we're going to talk about resistance and why people have such a hard time adopting these kinds of ideas sometimes. And we're going to try to take a pretty human take on that. So I'm going to go the opposite size, right? So if I go and I'm working in a really small company, or I have a department and I'm totally in control of that department. Say I work for a small product team, and there's like 20 of you, and you own the product and you own the pipeline, and you own the packaging, and you own everything. A lot of the kind of stuff that I'm talking about might not be necessary, right? And so I want to be pragmatic about that, right? It's not like, I mean, the things that we talked about, the structure of the organization, how you enable with practices, how you govern value, like I've seen even small organizations jack that kind of stuff up too, right? So just because you're small doesn't necessarily mean that this stuff is like necessarily intuitive. But there is such a thing, what I call is like accidental agility, like where somebody says, okay, well, I worked in this small organization. I taught people Scrum, and they got it like really super easy. And they were able to break into a couple small teams, and there wasn't a whole lot of dependencies between them. And so they formed around Scrum, and like everything kind of worked. I met a CIO probably about 6 or 7 years ago that had come out of a smaller environment, and then she became the CIO of a large environment. And those are kind of interesting people to talk to because what happens is they have a point of view around what does it take to adopt Agile. And I say, well, we taught these teams Scrum, and everything was great. And we empowered them, and everything was great, and they all did the right thing. But they didn't have any of the structural barriers that a lot of large organizations have to deal with. And so it was kind of accidental that it worked. Yeah, I mean, you guys see this, right? I mean, so part of the challenge, right? So now we talked about size of organization, right? I mean, I came out of financial services. And so for anybody who's in Atlanta, you guys will probably remember 10, 12 years ago, Check Free Corporation. I got acquired by Fiserv about 10 years ago. Fiserv's still around. Sometimes client of ours here in town. And so large financial services, banking platforms, transactions, things like that. And in my early days, that was where I kind of dropped into Agile. I was working with a guy named Brian Sondergaard, who's part of our company here now. And we were doing some really large scale stuff, really complex systems, delivery organization, about 400. That's not even crazy massive, but it was pretty big at the time. And the size of the organization drove stuff like this, right? We had like, what I'm just going to really oversimplify this, but we had like a platform, right? A set of platform services, right? It was like in COBOL, right? And then, you would have any kind of, different front ends. Sometimes you'd have COBOL up here, sometimes you'd have .NET, sometimes you'd have Java, right? Different products all over the place. So you have different, product 1, product 2, product 3 that were consuming the platform. Then you'd have like, what you might call like an offering to a client, right? That was actually pieces of all of these different products, right? And they're making services calls out to the platform. And then you might have like some big, database engine, and then you might have some big reporting engine. And then I think in this case, we had like some other platform that was kind of like a risk server, right? We had just all this just different stuff, right, floating around. And back in the day, this was, 2002, 2003, when we were first starting to talk about this. And it was like, oh, you just form a complete cross-functional team. And you're kind of like, okay, like I get the idea of like T-shaped people, right? I get the idea of people being able to do like one thing or many things or like what have you. But it's like, in order to like, deliver a feature up here, I'd have to literally have a team of like 6 to 8 that were expert in Java, .NET, COBOL, that could interact with the platform, that understood how to change the database, that could change the reporting engine, that could change the risk engine, could change this database over here, right? And you start to think about it, and you're like, oh my gosh, like that's like a lot of stuff, right? That's a lot of stuff. And then you start to get into like all kinds of different things. Like some of these, different platforms have like really different levels of like domain expertise that was required. You had experts in like risk mitigation and different aspects of financial services. And it was just like really, really complicated, right? And so like the first kind of point that I wanted to try to make here is that when you're doing a transformation, how you untangle some of this stuff, it matters. And it doesn't like happen overnight. And so as transformation people, right, people who care about this space, we have to be really super pragmatic and realize that the size and the complexity of the enterprise that we are working with is going to absolutely impact our ability to be agile and to do agile. And so like under the best of conditions, like a lot of times what we'd see is you'd like, you maybe put a scrum team up here, right? And it's, trying to interact with this, but this is waterfall and these guys really aren't even in scope, and we can't change this. And it's just like, just on and on and on and on and on, right? So you kind of ask yourself, you're like, what does doing Scrum up here kind of really bias, right? And so like a lot of what I was talking about last week, like around changing the structure, like what we would do is different things. And this is going to be, again, just way oversimplification, but you might imagine a structure kind of like this, right? Where you have, a product team 1, a product team 2, product team 3. Those guys are, maybe if it's like a team or 2, maybe they're doing Scrum with a scrum of scrums or something like that. Maybe this is a team of 6 or 8 teams, right? They might be doing SAFe, right? These guys might have a group of very loosely coupled teams. Maybe they can do something like with less or something like that. And, these guys on the backside, they are, these are like COBOL mainframe, big dependencies, right? All that kind of stuff. They might be doing, candidly, like something like waterfall, right? God, I can't write today. I'm gonna have to, that was actually so illegible. I'm gonna have to write it again. Let's say waterfall, right? And so you ask yourself, okay, well, cool, right? Well, if these guys are agile and these guys are agile and these guys are agile, but they're all plugging into, right, this kind of waterfall thing, like, what do you go do, right? And so you have to start to think about, like, how do I untangle that, right? I want predictable, I want early return on investment, I want to be able to put products in the market, I want to be able to do all these things. Well, some of the strategies that we employed during that time was, these guys were at the time, I want to say, doing biannual releases, right? So like every 6 months. Maybe what happens is that these guys start off and, we figure out how to get them optimized where they can go every 3 months. Right? Maybe we move them to a point where they deploy every 6 weeks. So being super pragmatic, right? If I can get these guys to do 6-week waterfalls and get packaged release, and they're really good at delivering smaller batches, right? Then I can kind of create a roadmap of when these different services are going to come along, right? And then I can start pivoting the activity of these agile teams off of this much more predictable, albeit waterfall timeline, right? Not a purist mentality, right? But the size of the organization matters, right? And the complexity of the organization matters, right? Those are things that we have to deal with, and we have to be really pragmatic about. When we start to talk about cross-cutting concerns, and like I was talking about up here with this cross-cutting service offering, in a lot of these kinds of things, we might, pull elements of like disciplined agile delivery, right? I like to use, Kanban based process flows, right, to do governance. And so maybe we have features or epics coming in up here, right? And they're kind of chomping along from analysis and design to build to integration test to potential deployment, that kind of a thing. And as these things are getting pre-processed, right, they're coming into the Scrum team's backlog. They're going into a PI planning session, right? We're going into backlogs of a bunch of individual less teams, something like that, right? And you start to think about it, right? So now I'm being super pragmatic. I want predictability. I want early return on investment. I want a lower cost. I want a bunch of these different things, right? I can do that pragmatically by breaking my governance up into smaller batches, feeding these backlogs in a much more integrated way, right? And then allowing these guys to kind of operate with here, right? So you start to get into this thing where it's like really the complexity matters. Now, in a transformation story, right? So as I'm starting to orchestrate that transformation, one thing that's really fascinating is that for a lot of like really big, clumsy, legacy type organizations, just getting into small batch portfolio management with high coordinated backlogs across teams, integrated with a smaller batch size kind of platform. Like this is like a huge, huge win, right? It's not as agile as everybody wants to be, but it actually meets a lot of the demands of the organization. And here's the cool thing, right? These guys win because they're able to deliver things to their customers more frequently. These guys win because they're able to do pure play Scrum and operate with autonomy within their pocket, right? They can start to mock out and do different things to anticipate like this release schedule down here with this team, right? So they can start to build their backlog with really clearly defined sync points down here, right? So these guys get to deliver with a lot of agility. These guys are delivering in smaller batches and getting really predictable. You got a group up here that's basically coordinating the flow of value, so we're not doing late dependency resolution, all those kinds of things, right? And we start to put together a really nice integrated system. Is it as agile as we would want to be? Like, no, but this is like a pretty complicated thing, right? So when you start to go down, like as we start to get into how to actually orchestrate transformations and how to actually start to plan and coordinate this kind of stuff, that's where we're going to start to lay the foundation for in the next series that we're going to do. Right? What starts to happen is that you start to get pockets where these things can be pretty darn agile, right? And the organization starts to learn how to exploit the value of smaller batches and more agile, iterative, and incremental type practices. And where it can go, right, is that maybe, and it's not always true, right, but maybe we can start slicing the organization and the capabilities of the organization a little differently. And we can start to think about how we would create, maybe something around a value stream like this, right? Then we can start to think about how to realign the organization. And so the transformation pattern in the presence of complexity, when I'm focused on actually solving business problems rather than being dogmatic about what agile is and what agile isn't, right? I can start to derive that business benefit as I go. And then as I start to lay this foundation, I can start to, as I break dependencies and realign the organization, I can start to decouple things and have them operate with more independence, greater agility, more local autonomy, right? As the organization learns how to exploit these new capabilities. Okay. Now think about it. I'm going to go back to what I was talking about before. If I get super dogmatic about, oh, this is culture change, right? Then where does that leave me in this context, in this broader context? Like, okay, empower your people, let them decide. Well, okay, but you got a small team of people up here that doesn't have agency to decide everything that they're responsible for, right? So they get to decide here, but they don't get to decide for the rest of it. And so what tends to happen, right, and this is what we see when this idea of this culture first or practices first starts to happen, and we're dealing with these dependencies and these large scale interconnections between things, is that people start to locally optimize. And they start to do Agile really well here. And but it actually sometimes will sub-optimize the rest of the system, right? Because this thing that used to be waterfall, and even though it was slow and clumsy and maybe didn't even work all that great, we were doing death marches and things like that, it kind of worked nicely with everything else. Now these guys are sitting here trying to do Agile and not willing to make any commitments, and basically just as velocity, show up in the team room, right? All the stuff sometimes we talk about, right? It actually becomes disruptive to the rest of the organization. So getting this team to do Agile is not always the best first step, because that team might become great at doing Agile, but if it doesn't actually solve this broader ecosystem type problem, like it doesn't matter to the business, right? It's a great example. And that kind of the hypothesis is if I get it working one place, then, then it will spread and go to other places. But what I think we see in practice a lot is that it actually gets shut down, because even though it was a great example of something that was working, it was so incongruent with how the rest of the organization worked, is that, we really couldn't do anything about it. Okay. So it's fascinating, right? And so again, in high complexity, large organizations, lots of people, lots of interconnections, things like that, the idea of teaching people practices is only going to get us so far. And that kind of sets up our next conversation, which we've been dancing around, because it's hard to have any conversation around any of this stuff without getting into the dependency world, right? And dependencies are the thing. Right? In large organizations, I say this probably every second webinar that we do. It's like when you're dealing with dependencies, you have two choices. You either manage dependencies or you break dependencies. If you disregard dependencies, like what you're going to get is what I just talked about. You're going to get local optimization. And so like, here's the thing, right? So let's say we get back into this world. I'm just going to draw just 3 teams here, right? So let's say we have a Scrum team, and we have a waterfall team, and we have a safe team, right? These guys are trying to release every 12 weeks. These guys are trying to release every 2 weeks. These guys are trying to release every 18 months, right? And you say, okay, they all have dependencies between them, right? And they all have to be coordinated, because in order to get something we care about to market, I need all 3 of the pieces, right? Simple oversimplification here. Right? So if I say, okay, in the presence of dependencies, I'm just going to deal with this team by itself, and I'm going to teach it practices, and I'm going to teach it culture, and I don't have it aligned with the rest of the organization, again, right? It might do very well on its own, and it might be a shining example of Scrum, but this stuff doesn't happen. Right. When this kind of anchored in my brain, I think you guys some of you guys know some of my history. I was a consultant for version 1 before I started leading Agile. And what was kind of cool for me during that time is I did a lot of going into big organizations and training them on how to use a version 1 tool and some basics of Agile and things like that. And then once every so often I'd go up and work with somebody for a week, or work with them for a couple of weeks or something. But that was not really leading or version 1's business model. So it didn't happen very often. But there was this one time I went to Boston. I was working with this company for about a week. And what was really super fascinating was that they had like 6 or 7 teams. And this was what was interesting, is all of them were doing Agile. Okay. But they all had dependencies between them. And so even in a system where everything's Agile and there are dependencies between the teams, it only takes one of the teams to be able to be non-performant, and it'll cause all of the other teams in the system it'll cause them to fail, right? So like, it's like what we just talked about on steroids, right? We've got all 6 of these things, right? Back in those days, I guess safe wasn't as much of a thing as it is now, right? And so they were doing, independent Scrum, right? Kind of doing a Scrum of Scrums model to get everybody coordinated. And this is actually a rather idealized case in a lot of organizations. And like one team is like not performing for whatever reason because it's got technology issues or team issues or whatever, right? And the whole system couldn't produce value. Let's go to SAFE now, right? So let's say we wrap that organization in like PI planning, right? And we get in, we do the big room stuff. We go off and we do our things. We've understood our dependencies. We're operating. Maybe we've even front loaded some of those dependencies and we're trying to get them resolved early. Maybe we're even doing like a little bit of Kanban-esque stuff internally and we're prioritizing backlogs so we get feature value out of the system even early within the PI, right? We get to the end. If there's dependencies on that team, right, then we fail. Okay, so you either manage dependencies or you break dependencies, right? There's this thing out of theory of constraints that I think is like super valuable, where you talk about the idea of in dependent systems, you have to basically subordinate the system to the constraint, right? So it can only go as fast as the slowest piece, right? You elevate the constraint, which basically means you put resources into it to help it go faster, right? So here you kind of accept that it goes slower and you slow down everybody else to the slowest piece, right? Here you elevate the constraint or you exploit the constraint. Am I getting that right? Yeah. Where basically you make the constraint only do the things that the constraint is absolutely supposed to do, the only things it has to do, and then you basically take everything else off that team, right? So we really have kind of a constraints problem in the presence of dependencies, and that's kind of like the core issue in a lot of these things. And so like what kinds of dependencies are we dealing with, right? Dependencies can be probably, let's say, one of three different categories, and I'm kind of like just riffing here a little bit, right? But you can have technical dependencies, right? I would suggest you can have organizational dependencies, and then probably like requirements dependencies, right? And technical ones are oftentimes, I think, the ones that are the hardest to break. They're the most expensive to break because you've got a working system fundamentally, but everything's like really tightly coupled. And so organizing teams around those the components or the pieces of the technology, or even getting like multiple independent teams to work across that really tightly coupled stack, like it's really difficult. Those dependencies create all kinds of chaos, right? They create unintended consequences. We change code over here, right? Something breaks over here. It happens in an unpredictable way. We have multiple teams in the same code base interacting in, sometimes dynamic and destructive ways with each other. Even if like we have like a really clear sense of like modules and sub-functions and things like that, and we organize teams around that, but their dependencies, sometimes it creates unintended code consequences in there, right? So technical dependencies are the ones that are really, really difficult to break. And those are the ones often that the organization hasn't fully signed up to break because they don't understand the impacts of how that's going to prevent us from being able to produce an increment of working tested software at the end of the sprint and being able to ultimately establish stable velocity against the known backlog, which is the fundamental thing of becoming predictable and releasing early, right? So you have technical dependencies. You have a class of dependencies that I would consider organizational dependencies, right? Things like, and this really gets into like teaming strategy and org design. So are we going to create functional silos, or are we going to create complete cross-functional teams? So if I create a complete cross-functional team, and let's say I make the decision to have a QA person, let's say I have a QA specialist or tech writer or whoever, right, spread across multiple teams, that person is a dependency. And you can say, no, Mike, they're not a dependency because, they're 30% allocated here, 30% allocated here, 30% allocated here. But we know how that works, right? If one team starts to struggle or that person is needed at a time where we didn't anticipate needing them, right, their presence or their requirement to be on these other teams is going to be slowed down by the fact that they're getting oversubscribed by this team that's struggling. Okay, creates a requirements dependent, or excuse me, an organizational dependency, a person dependency, right? So anytime we have Scrum teams with non-dedicated team members, or at the extreme of that, like functional silos and project teams, we have dependencies between projects, right? We have delivery dependencies because this team can't can't overcome its problems because their person isn't available to them. And then you start getting into more kind of lean concepts like the idea of cost accounting versus throughput accounting, right? And so what Agile really relies on is this idea, and this is like a core idea to be able to explain to the organization why it's so important to have complete cross-functional teams. Because their model from a costing perspective is we have these really, really expensive people, and we want them to do the thing that they are the absolute best at. But what they're absolute best at isn't required during all phases of even the sprint, let alone a project lifecycle or whatever. At least that's the hypothesis in a more waterfall-minded world, right? So what the idea is because we're thinking about cost and maximizing the value of that resource, right? We spread these people out across multiple things. Problem with that, right, we know is that we don't really know the requirements, right? All kinds of dependencies, right? All kinds of different stuff. And so, apologize, I should have turned that off. All kinds of different stuff. What starts to happen is that these people get spread out. And again, we have the dependency phenomenon. And so, but it's driven from a cost accounting mindset. So what Agile's really advocating is this throughput accounting mindset, where what we're basically saying is that while the cost of the person, the cost of the resource might be higher because it's dedicated to a team, the extra efficiency associated with having that person instantly available is going to enable us to create greater throughput, put product into market faster on a more regular basis. And even though it's more expensive, right, we can acknowledge that it's probably more expensive, enables us to add value and to produce product that we can sell more regularly and more predictably. So we might actually increase some human resource costs, but we're doing it so we can drive throughput up. And if we can measure that and we can show how the throughput and the value associated with getting out of this cost accounting mentality, right? That's part of the challenge. The reason it's one of the challenges with the whole offshore thing. It's like offshoring is largely a cost accounting kind of play at the expense of throughput, right? Sometimes it's more expensive to drive throughput, but if the return on investment is greater, sometimes you can overcome the cost accounting mentality. Right? So that's kind of like the idea, right? So when I do this slide, I kind of blow through, like, there's all kinds of different dependencies in organizations. But what you guys have to recognize, and you have to start to develop arguments for, is understanding the nature of the dependencies, why they become so expensive when we're trying to adopt Agile, and then to be able to counter the expense argument with the value argument in a very structured and disciplined and measurable way so that you can actually start to move people, right? And so, again, just anchoring back on what this talk is about is like, why is this stuff so difficult? Right? Well, the size of the organization is so complex. The amount of things that is going through the value stream, the things the value stream is touching are so complex. And there's dependencies between everything, right? And there's this idea of cost accounting versus throughput accounting, right? You just layer and layer and layer and layer. And then you start getting into human resistance, right? So people, it's like people are frustrating sometimes. But people aren't stupid, right? They see their world. And I would suggest, right, that there are, and I don't know if this is like a growth mindset versus fixed mindset thing, but there are people who tend to kind of look at their situation and they go, this is what it is. This is my world. Let me figure out how to best operate within my world given the constraints that I have. Okay. And I look at PMI's framework and the PMBOK, and I kind of dropped out of the PMBOK conversation around PMBOK 3, PMBOK 4. I think the last PMBOK I actually read was PMBOK 3. And so I don't know how that has evolved with the advent of PMI ACP and some of the adoption of Agile and stuff like that. But back in the day, that whole traditional PMI world, to me, was largely about the organization is what the organization is. Let me give you the best set of processes and tools to be able to navigate complexity given the state of your world. And I think that's how a lot of us are wired. And that's how a lot of people are wired. The world is what it is. Let me figure out how to operate as efficiently in it as I possibly can. And just know that's kind of just like a lot of people are. Right. And then there's a lot of people that get kind of in our world where we're kind of like, okay, if all things were possible, right, we could do anything we wanted to do. This would be my idealized end state. And this is how the world should work. Right. I think we're seeing a lot of this in like politics and society today, right? With kind of conservatives and progressives. Like, it's like there's people that are kind of like, this is the way the world works. And there other people are like, this is the way the world should work. And both are kind of like right to some degree, right? Because this is how the world works. And if you're pragmatic, this is how you operate in the world. But maybe the world shouldn't work this way. Maybe it should work this other way. And the question is, right, is like, and there's some people that like just see that so clearly and they just want to be there now. Right. And I think that's where a lot of the agile community is. It's like, you just want to be there now. But there's this path in the middle that says, okay, let's acknowledge the way the world is today. And then let's have a vision for where we want to get it to be. And then how do we incrementally and iteratively start to lay the foundations for making the kinds of changes that we want to make? And so we have to recognize that when we're engaging with organizations and we're trying to lead change, we have people that see the world from lots of different kinds of angles. And some of it, and this is like the human part that I want to talk about a little bit, some of this stuff is just like really personal, right? And so the story that I like to tell is it was a story about a lady that I worked with probably 15, 20 years ago, who would absolutely fall into the classic person's disruptive, person doesn't want to change, person can't see the future, right? You're just your classic command and control manager. And as an agilist, it's very easy to want to make that like, and to over personalize it. And because it feels like at some point, because we're so clear on where we want to be, it feels like this person's just being difficult. And I see so much of the literature attacking managers like that because they see the world the way they see it. They're being very pragmatic about their current state and they don't want to change, right? And I had this moment of empathy with this person. This is kind of a long story, but I actually happened to know her next door neighbor and just like totally casual one time, like heard a story about like her situation. And she was like primary breadwinner, had a kid in college, husband was trying to start a business. She was, basically like all this financial stuff. And I was sitting there thinking one day, I was like, here you have a person that has become incredibly successful, VP of something or other, right? Whatever, large company, really powerful, large organization, has a tremendous amount of stuff invested in the status quo. And if you think about it, right, there's like a Machiavelli quote. I'm going to like totally butcher this, but it's something like beware of the person that like introduces change, because at best you're going to get, or at worst you're going to get resistance from the people that choose to, that are going to suffer from the change, right? And then you're going to get at best lukewarm support from the people that that might be inclined to support you because they don't know if you're going to be successful. And it gets a little bit almost like into we need to be more specific at step 2. And we have to figure out how to create safety for people and meet them where they are. Because a lot of this resistance, right? And I have a bit of empathy for this because, leading Agile, we're not gigantic, but like 120 people, right? And so most of what I spend my time doing is paying attention to our organizational design and our operating model, because that's the space where I live, right? And I think about those kinds of things often. But as like CEO, right, it's really easy, right, to think about like, I want to change, right, and to give direction and like, okay, you guys go make this work, right? And down here, it's really easy to see the problems on the ground. But the middle managers that we deal with, right, they're dealing with they're abstracting a lot of the complexity of the organization, right? So it's easy for me down here to be like really focused on the thing that I do and to see how to do it better. Can't tell you how many times somebody will come up to me in my little company and go, hey, Mike, we need to do this, blah, blah, blah. It's super clear to me. This is a problem we need to fix. And like where my head explodes, I go like, yeah, but that one thing is connected to these other 50,000 things. And you're only attaching it to this one business problem. And I've got like these 10 business problems, right? So I see this tremendous amount of complexity, right? And yes, this might be a really smart idea, but it's likely a local optimization for the big thing that I want to do. If I'm sitting here at the top, it's really easy to kind of live in an ivory tower. And a lot of the complexity of the organization is abstracted because we have these armies of middle managers that are actually like dealing with all this like crazy complexity. Okay. So it's easy for me or the CEO to sit in a seat and go, okay, yep, be agile, right? Great. And these guys are like, yes, let's form teams, right? Like I'm telling you, like architects in an organization are super fascinating people to engage, especially senior architects, because you guys might get some resistance from some of these guys because they see the organization's architecture and they see the technology architecture and they see the dependencies and they see the amount of coordination that's going on across this organization, the amount of heavy lifting that is required to get anything through the organization. And a lot of times these folks become very heavy governance focused because they intimately see the complexity. The thing about architects is they can be largely in your corner as an agilist if you take this kind of structure, organization, alignment, dependency focused kind of world, because what they can do is they can recognize good architecture and they recognize the power of encapsulation and how to deal with orchestration kinds of issues, right? And so middle managers kind of fall someplace in between, right? They're brute forcing all of this complexity that sometimes the people on the ground don't see, and oftentimes the C-suite doesn't see. Right. And I think we marginalize this group kind of at our peril. Right. Because here's the thing, right? Getting back to my Machiavelli quote, right? There's a lot of people that are going to lose in this new structure. And the people that might win or think it's a better way of doing things, they don't know if you're going to be successful. Okay. So like what we found in transformation work is that we have to come up with ways of engaging this group of people, helping them see the end state and how they benefit in the end state, and then how we're going to incrementally, iterative and incrementally change the organization so that the wheels don't fall off. And the one thing I would just encourage everybody, whether you're operating at this level or you're operating at this level, is that sometimes it's hard to see this army of people in the middle and the amount of complexity that they're coordinating. And so as we start to get into the next session and we start to unpack like, okay, let's make this stuff really real. We probably have a couple more theoretical things before we start getting into kind of like real deep stuff, but like how-to kinds of things. But the journey is, you know, taking this kind of big tangled mess of spaghetti, right? That is largely being led by the C-suite, right? Executed by the teams, right? Such that they are whatever form, right? And the complexity is being dealt with, you know, well, poorly, whatever, by middle management, right? And laying out a path for how you get to, you know, this kind of portfolio driven, governed set of teams, right? Like some of the models that we talk about here, right? Where everything is structured and neatly ordered and, you know, flow value and cost throughput accounting or cost accounting, all that kind of stuff. But getting from this place to this place through the human beings with hopes and fears and families and financial situations and careers, things that are at risk, right? All that kind of stuff. What I would suggest is that one of the biggest challenges to transformation and getting middle management on board is creating safety and creating clarity and developing like a very clear path for how we're going to do it. Because going back to like my senior architect kind of a thing, if I'm down here, if I'm up here and I say, okay, you can have money for coaches and you can have money for training. And I'm down here and I'm like, yes, coaches and training, right? agile teams, right? Don't hold me to a schedule, right? Don't manage dependencies, right? Everything's loosely coupled, everything's just Scrum, blah, blah, right? Then these people in the middle that are like, oh my God, how is that going to work? I don't know, right? It's so where we're headed in this whole conversation is in a large, complicated organization with lots of dependencies and people that have built careers around the status quo. How do you lay out a structured and disciplined path to get there? And maybe tying back to last week and how this kind of all hangs is that these people in the middle can't see how empowering their teams can help, right? They don't see how culture and mindset is going to change this mess of complexity. They don't see how doing daily stand-up meetings and reviews and retrospectives is actually going to solve the problem because they're dealing with this big mess in the middle. Okay. So our job as transformation people is to recognize that what they see is indeed true. And if we're going to untangle it, we have to create a really structured path and a really structured language and a really structured way of orchestrating the transformation so that we can create safety and overcome resistance and actually deal with the dependencies and deal with the organizational complexity as like a first order concern. Because just telling them that they're not agile or that they don't get it or they don't have the right mindset, like it just doesn't work, right? They're just going to get in our way. Okay. So I left us 2 minutes, Tim. Any questions? Like anything we can try to hit before we wrap up here today?
Yeah. So I think this goes back to some of the stuff you're talking about dependencies, but I'll just read the question. I agree with the approach and have leveraged it in prior experience. However, it never fails that the business will introduce new high priorities that were not planned for that impacts the timeline of those waterfall-like dependencies. Any thoughts on this?
Okay, give it to me again. I'm not sure I fully grasped that.
So the heart of it is, what do you do when the business introduces new like high priorities? Like, so you have all this structure and then they just come in and say, hey, this is the hot thing, go do it.
Yeah, well, so the tension there, right? The tension is that the only way the business knows how to get anything done is by just shoving things into the system, right? That is an artifact of a system that has not been predictable and performant. And we could go on for about 20 or 30 minutes of examples of different scenarios that I've seen in the past. But generally what you have to do, right, when you're doing a transformation is get the business to settle down for a minute, build a predictable system that's performant, that can deliver iteratively and incrementally, and then teach the business how to exploit that. That's not a day one kind of a thing because the relationship between the business and IT is often so dysfunctional. The only thing the business understands is I need it now, give it to me, blame the IT organization when they don't get it. That is a function of a broken IT organization and a dysfunctional relationship between the business and IT. It takes some time to fix that, right? So the general idea is the IT group creates safety, right? Delivers that what it can do and learns how to make and meet commitments. And we teach the business how to exploit that. There's a comment, right? This is from Nat that he made a comment and this is what I'm gonna end on because this is like another interesting thing for me, right? So just an observation, we shouldn't talk about people as resources. I totally get that that's a hot button for a lot of people. And I almost provocatively go into it. I use words like human resources. I also intersperse words like people. Like I did that very intentionally because here's the interesting thing, right? As I know that people are sensitive to calling human beings resources, I totally get it. From a project point of view, they are, this is gonna sound cold, units of performance that get allocated to a project to get work done, right? And I totally understand it's dehumanizing, but from a purely technical perspective, they are resources. Okay. What we want to try to do in an agile world is to stop getting the organization to look at human beings as the unit of value, right? And start to think about the team as the unit of throughput. And if we can get the team to be the container that produces value, then we can start to humanize the people that work in that team to produce the value. So I'm being provocative. I'm often provocative. I'm often poking at a lot of things, but I totally get the point. But even getting from a human resources view of the world to this empowered human being part of the world, like that's part of the transformation. Just getting dogmatic about don't call people human resources because they're people, like I just don't think that serves us, right? That's like a mindset thing. And we go, okay, well, so let's say I just call them people and I stop calling them human resources. Like what problem does that actually solve for me? If I haven't put them in the right container, if I haven't enabled within the right processes, if I don't have everything else aligned, that culture change, that mindset change doesn't actually make anything more predictable. It just makes us feel better. And I guess that matters to some people, but I'm telling you, I'm a brutal pragmatist when it comes to this kind of stuff. And like my goal isn't to change language, it isn't change hearts and minds. It's about to creating like really solid, predictable operating models that the organization can learn how to trust so that we can actually fix this stuff and actually produce organizations that can produce value in the market. So anyway, I just wanted to do that. That's actually why I didn't hear the other question very well, is because I saw that come up and I'm like, oh, my brain just wanted to go down that path. So thank you guys all for being here. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks when we do our next one.